The American Civil Rights Movement by Jalen Hernandez. How did the Civil Rights Movement begin? The Civil Rights Movement began on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks, a black seamstress, refused to cooperate with the segregation law. As she boarded a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, she was on her way back from home from a long, tiring day of work, and the buses had a back section for the people of color and the front was only for white people. That day she decided to sit in the front and refused to give up her seat. Who was involved from the beginning? Arguably, one of the most famous events of the Civil Rights Movement took place on August 28, 1963. The March on Washington. It was organized and attended by civil rights leaders such as Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King Jr. What were the objectives of the Civil Rights Movement? The purpose of the Civil Rights Movement was to establish equal rights for African Americans, since an incident on a bus started the protest. When was the American Civil Rights Movement? The American Civil Rights Movement started in the mid-1950s. A major catalyst in the push of the civil rights was in December 1955. Where did it take place? It took place in Montgomery, Alabama. Why did it happen? The civil rights movement began because African Americans were treated so unfairly. No white person liked them, but if there was a white person with a person of color, they would get judged for that. They had white schools and black schools. Everything was separated by colors. For example, schools, restaurants, sinks, libraries, bathrooms, and so much more. African Americans were tired of this, so they stood up for themselves and made a change for their people. History. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. World War II and the Civil Rights. The World War II was a global war that lasted from 1939 to 1945. It involved the vast majority of the world's countries. The civil rights is the rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an American activist in the civil rights movement, best known for her pivotal role in the Montgomery bus boycott. Little Rock Nine. Little Rock Nine was a group of 9 African American students. The students were initially prevented from entering the racially segregated school by overall favors. History. Civil Rights Act of 1957. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was the first federal civil rights legislation passed by the United States Congress. Woodward's lunch counter. Lunch counter was where the series of Greensboro sit-ins, protests against racial segregation caused by Jim Crow laws began. Freedom Riders, a person who challenged a racial law in the American South in the 1960s, refusing to abide by the laws designating that seating in buses be segregated by race. March on Washington. The March on Washington was a massive protest march that occurred in August 1963 when some 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial live TV shows. History. Civil Rights of Act 1964. The Civil Rights Act 1964 is a landmark civil rights and labor law in the United States that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and later sexual orientation and gender identity. Blood Sunday. Blood Sunday was a massacre on January 30, 1972, in the Bogside area of Derry, Northern Ireland, when British soldiers shot 27 civilians during a protest march against internment without trial. Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act is a landmark piece of federal legislation in the United States that prohibits racial discrimination in voting. History. Civil rights leaders assassinated. Medgar Evers, Emmett Louis Till, Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Earl Chaney, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. Harry, Harriet Move, Fred Hampton. History. Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Fair House Act of 1968 prohibits discrimination in the purchase, state, rental, or financing of housing, private or public, based on race, skin color, sex, nationality, or religion.